and authoritarian government.
Tom, Caddy K has a question for you. Caddy?
Hi, Tom. Let's talk about the demographics and racial changes in America and how that plays into this. We know the country is becoming less white, probably faster than we realized. And to what extent is that feeding this sense of nostalgia amongst certain groups of the population, and particularly amongst white men who benefited when it was white men who were running the show unquestionably? Is it overly simplistic to say that's driving some of the people that are out there saying things aren't as good for me as they used to be?
Oh, no, I think that's directly a cause of a lot of this. And, you know, I've talked again, there are some of these stories from my own hometown where people that I grew up with who are now prosperous. I had a friend who, you know, Spence's working class guy that I went to school with from the time we were small children, spends his weekends on his boat. Life's been pretty good. And he says, it's awful. Everything has to change. And what he really means is that the street we grew up on, that, you know, where the neighborhood, we had a neighborhood barber and a candy store and a diner, and that, you know, one of them's an antique shop now, and another is a Spanish storefront church, and the library is closed, and he just wants it to be, it's like a midlife crisis for a lot of white males for whom they just want it to be 1969 again. And I think that problem of becoming a minority is really anxiety producing for a lot of them. But again, the answer to that is more democracy, not some kind of illiberal backlash and trying to turn the clock back by force. But again, they've been told by opportunistic politicians and political entrepreneurs that with just enough willpower and rage and anger and resentment that they can just turn the hands of time back and, you know, make it 1965 again.
Mike Barnicle.
So, Tom, I know your hometown, and it's very similar to my hometown. And I think both of us grew up without a lot of wealth, but we grew up on streets in neighborhoods where we were never alone and we were never without hope. So what has happened in the intervening years to create so much hopelessness, so much loneliness, so much of a sense that now as Americans in a nation of 325 million people, we are all walking alone? What happened?
You know, that's a great point, Mike, that no matter how bad things were, and I did not feel a lot of sense of hope as a boy, as I point out in the piece this morning. My early teenage years could easily have ended up in jail. That was probably a more likely path. Yeah, I mean, you know, the path to jail was clearer and easier than it was to college. That's for sure. And but you were right. We were never alone. And what's really striking, and I talk about this in the book, is that we have become some of the loneliest people in the world because we've chosen to, because we would just prefer, because the solitary leisure of that we can just have at our fingertips because of this immense standard of living that we enjoy, has really made us kind of a nation of solitary loners. You know, if you want to play blackjack, you don't have to go to a casino. You can open your phone and get a blackjack table. If you want to watch a movie, you can call up any movie you want on your television. One of my friends actually had a great observation that hadn't occurred to me. He said, when we grew up, Mike, when people like you and I grew up, everybody had a porch out front. And that was my street back home had people every summer, or people sitting on their porches. Now he says everyone has decks. They sit behind their houses, out of view, not talking to anybody. We've become this very solitary nation, and it's making us crazy, even as we've become more affluent. And that affluence has actually enabled a lot of that solitary activity in ways that we don't even think about. And again, as I say in the book, that's our choice. That kind of consumerism and solitary activity and focus on our own leisure, we chose that.
You know, Tom, you talk about this belief that we've been failing since, the early 70s. Everybody wants it to be 1965 again. I remember in the early 70s in upstate New York, seeing things closing and my parents saying it's going to Japan, it's going here, it's going there. Isn't part of the problem that everybody is that a generation has been on like this 50-year whine about American decline when we haven't been declining, but they grew up thinking every decade should be like the 1950s. That the United States should dominate everything, and that was not sustainable, of course, because 50% of the world's industrial output was blown to pieces during World War II. So obviously that wasn't going to be sustainable when Japan, Germany, other countries rebuilt their countries.
Yeah, it's interesting that there was an excerpt from the book about a week ago in The Atlantic, and Mike will smile, I think, because he knows my hometown. Someone from my hometown who had grown up there in the early 60s wrote to me, and he said, I know I'm a little older than you. He said, but gee, I seem to remember it as really a kind of a good time. And of course, he had grown up in the 1950s and early 60s, graduated from college in high school in 1965. And I said, that 15 years in America was a unique time. But as I pointed out to him, I said, both my brother and my father were cops. And I said, I think it was a great time for you, and it might have been a better time for me. But I don't know that I would have wanted to be a black man in my hometown dealing with my hometown cops. I don't know that I would have wanted to be a woman who had to ask for permission to get a car loan, in 1962. We have this very selective memory about what was great about it. Well, I had a union job. Well, yes. But there were a lot of other terrible things going on that you've kind of strained out of your memory. And I think anyone who's nostalgic for the 1970s, which really, I talk about this in the book, how often people set 1970 as a benchmark. I was a teenager in the 1970s. I cannot imagine a decade I would rather not go back to in my hometown and the way I grew up. But people have, sanitized these memories and turned them into sepia-toned photographs in their mind that just aren't true.
It's such a deep conversation that gets to the heart of where we are right now as a country. We'll continue it with you very soon, I'm sure. Tom, the new book is Our Own Worst Enemy, The Assault from Within on Modern Democracy. Tom Nichols, thanks so much. We'll see you soon. We want to end the hour with the story that for the first time since the start of the pandemic, veterans and their caregivers are now able to